So, Boris Debic, thank you so much for your time today in regards to speaking with us and your experience in Silicon Valley, and specifically at Google for the past 15 years. We're grateful to have you on our advisory board since you now moved to Croatia and are teaching full-time at University of Zagreb School of Economics. I wanted to discuss your experience in these 15 years working in Silicon Valley and specifically at Google. So what led you go to Google? How long, what was the experience like there? And maybe you could share a little bit about that.
So I spent 24 years in Silicon Valley. I arrived on Christmas '96, and I switched between a couple of startups. I was always attracted to startups, small environments, collegial, like working environment, like not a lot of bureaucracy. I spent, like 3.5 years at the United Nations, which is a huge organization. It is 120,000 people all around the world. And this was, like quite refreshing, like doing the startup round, so to speak. So one of the startups was E.piphany, which was a very successful thing. I was 11th engineer there, and then eventually the company grew to 1,200 people. It went public. It had actually a secondary IPO from there, and it was like full of very, very bright people, I have to say, from Stanford, CMU, MIT, and all of the other usual places. Then in 2005, I got an invitation to join Google's release engineering team because they were suddenly a public company and they had to start doing certain things the way the law requires you to do, like Sarbanes-Oxley Act and other various things that's like the regulators. I believe that was introduced after the Enron debacle. So I went there, and like it's like Google at that time was already like over 2,000 people. I think the engineering department was around 1,200 engineers, like a huge organization already in my view. And I said to myself, well, I'll go there, like I'll do a gig, like spend a year and a half there, and then move on, like to my next startup adventure. However, like as soon as I got into Google, like you get really sucked by the brilliance of the people who work there. Some of them don't work anymore, but like a lot of very bright people still do work at Google, and I have like many friends there still. And but like many have also left Google in the meantime. So the growth of Google in those 15 years went from something less than $1 billion per year, I think it was in the hundreds of millions of revenue, to now, like in the billions that I forgot how to count that high. And, like the company grew from, like I thought, like I'll spend a little time, and I spent 15 years. The company grew from, like a couple thousand people to over 200,000 people today, all over the world.
Now, when you mentioned those numbers of 200,000 people today that it has and its staff, I believe a lot of that is contractors. Were you ever a contractor at Google, or were you always a full-time employee?
No, I was never. I was once a contractor, but early on in my Silicon Valley career, and it was a very, very short period because they, like the people, like wanted to hire me immediately. But Google, yes, you're right. And that is one of the aspects that the company changed very much. So in the early days, contractors were, like only a few very specific positions, which were very tedious work. Like machine learning and machine intelligence was not that developed yet. But you had to rate ads because, like from very early on, the founders put a policy that no, we can't advertise, I don't know, guns and alcohol. And, like there's a couple of themes that like will never get advertised in Google Ads. And like and then there's the like quality of the ads. Like you don't want to like put ads in the system which are actually scams or things like like of that sort of nature. So like there were positions where we really needed contractors because it's a very tedious job. You're doing one and the same thing all day. It's like it's not unlike flipping burgers, like the whole day. And like we knew that like people wouldn't last. Like I mean, I think the average span for somebody working in that group was around 6 to 8 months, and then they either moved into Google if like if they found a good position and they were a match, or they just move on with their career. These days, however, I believe it was maybe 2 or 3 years ago that we crossed a threshold where over half of the employees of the company are contracting workforce. Some of it, like, and there's a larger context around this. Like obviously some of it was driven by business needs. Some of it, like may have been driven by, like getting some extra profit and not having to take the responsibility for those people in the full. Some of it's, like it's the way the whole of Silicon Valley operates, where, like, I don't know, the cooks or the janitors, like they are subcontracted to other companies. They're managed by other companies. We used to have, I mean, like the first chef was Charlie Ayers. He was an employee of the company. And the early batch of chefs and, like even cooks and lower staff were actually employees, but that eventually changed. And, like I was not part of this decision-making chain in that process. I mean, it was obviously a function of the rapid growth and expansion of the company, probably also some cost cutting and, like, because, like there were, like quite a few chefs that there was a period of time where many of them actually left the company and they said, well, this is not the culture we were employed into. And, like, we're going to find something else to do.
Well, I mean, at Amazon and elsewhere that I worked at, consultants and contractors were treated as second-class citizens. They wouldn't be invited to the Christmas party. They wouldn't be invited to the mixer. You don't see them socially. They're the ones that do the actual work, but a lot of them are behind.
I mean, look, so like, let me try to put some more light on this thing. So, like some of this, in the way the current state of the world operates, and like that's also questionable, right? I mean, we can question that, but like the current state of how at least the West Coast operates, like for some positions, contractors do make sense because like if they're not part of your core business, like like then like it makes sense to like have engineers and like the people who are doing work on whatever is your core business, that is somehow part of the core of the company. And then other things are either partnerships or like in some cases contractors. I guess one example that is sort of off the ball here, and it's probably because of the early culture, is like Apple. I believe that, I'm not sure because I don't really follow Apple that closely, but I believe that their Apple stores, like for the most part, those are Apple employees for the most part. I'm not sure about that. Maybe that has changed too, like maybe their bottom line also has changed things, but I remember that. And that's sort of, like non-core business in a way, but then again, like selling a product and having a good experience in the purchase of the product. I mean, that is part of Apple's DNA. So the one thing that, let me just conclude maybe with this. The one thing that ties relatively closely to what you said about the rights that contractors have and the current state of Google is, like at one point in the recent couple of years, Google decided that they need an outside consultant to help them fight, like labor organizing. I was never involved, like in closely with any labor organizing, although I did propose a sort of relatively radical thing, like around the time of the big walkout at Google, when like the big scandal and like the 5 demands. And so I can talk about like that little detail later. But what I wanted to say is that like when I think that the sort of the rise of contracting and the involvement of IRI consultants, there's probably some correlation in those two things. As you said, like contractors, like they can't speak up. They, like can't say, hey, like what we're doing is wrong. I mean, they're there to do their job, go home, and like that's it. Some of the privileges that you mentioned that they don't have, and or they have, some of it is sometimes it's due to legal constraints, because like employees have different legal obligations to the company than contractors. So like sometimes you can't get contractors into, I don't know, highly sensitive meetings that are like responding to, for example, in Google's case, to the consent decree which was issued by the FTC. Like they're not privy to that. They're not privy like to some of these conversations because of the legal status, and like that's somewhat understandable. But changing the culture and preventing not, I would not necessarily say like labor organizing, because the labor organizing thing, there were people who were doing that and pushing for some form of that. But I can tell you that like within technology, like there's a lot more people who, no, we're fine, like let's just continue as it is. So, but they still like started changing the mix. And I don't think like having that many contractors is ultimately a super healthy thing. I mean, there are organizations that have lots of contractors. NASA is one good example. NASA is essentially like just a management organization, and pretty much almost all the work is done by either like contractors in the form of companies or people being contracted. But that's a different situation. It's a like it's a government thing, and they want to actually spread that money and have it go into the private sector, not necessarily like be a competition to the private sector. So like one can understand that from that context. This is something completely different.
In the case of NASA, I would say it's a privatization of space just as much as anything else by government funds, where the government is paying for the technology and private companies benefit from it. The universities work on it. And at the end of the day,
but I mean, there's space treaties as well, and there's lawyers at NASA who work, like on space treaty related things. So I don't think NASA will like privatize space and like paint NASA on the moon or on Mars anytime soon. I think it would probably be Elon Musk before them. But I mean, so there's like there's different contexts. You have to understand what I'm trying to say is the contracting context is very complex. You have to like take it all into account and understand what is like business driven and it makes sense, and what like seems to be a way to undermine like people's not people's, but like employee participation in the shaping of the company.
Okay. So Boris, just for the sake of time, our event is going to be short. We wanted to get to the part of, what ended up making you leave Google after all these years. What is it that you saw that was?
I guess that the real question would be what made me stay the last 5 years. Like, I mean, that the history of this is very long. I'll tell you frankly, like what made me stay is, like there's still very many good people there, and like it's a like in some respects it's a great working environment. I mean, there's a lot of collegialism still. There's a lot of very bright people from you can learn, which is really important. But like at the end of the day, like I started watching, like one by one, like either leave or being pushed out, or like their projects being canceled because they are asking too many insider related questions. Like like the big example of that is like the Macmillan, like who created the internal meme generator, which was sort of a vent for everybody to communicate the bad news really fast. And it was, like a thorn in the side of many, like VPs and higher execs, even, like going to the top of the leadership. And eventually, like, he was pushed away. There was, like one period in time where HR started dominating, grassroots efforts started throughout the company. So there was a lot of groups which were started by, like engineers who had an interest in this or had an interest in that, and they formed a group. And like eventually, like after the group grew and like what became highly popular, and like interesting discussions were on the group, they would come and they would co-opt the group, literally co-opt the group. I know about this from, like at least two examples. One was there was an early group, women engineers at Google, and it was, like self-organized by, like women engineers. Google did a lot of support for the Anita Borg Foundation, and like we gave out a lot of grants to women engineers, like for their PhDs and master degree studies. I was even on one of those committees that was granting these things. And so at one point, like the discussions became a bit too political for HR's taste, if you will, and they went in and they just relieved all of the seniors in that group, the ones who created the group, and like installed their own people, and from their own managed it according to what they said was HR rules. And the narrative was that no, this group was too close, we need to widen this group, and like have like a proper program and so forth. The same happened to like the early founders of the Talks at Google program. It went like through the same exact path, and like there was I had discussions over that because I was part of that thing, and I went to HR and I said, well, look, I mean, like the what they said there is that, like, oh, like we need to be accountable for the funds that go into the program, because they were buying books and they were paying for videotaping of the talks. And they said, no, we want, like to make the group accountable. And I said, well, that's perfectly fine. That's great. Like have a seat at our meeting, and, like whenever, like there's a project and there's funds associated with it, like you can vet it, you can say yes, no, whatever. However, like in those meetings, they brought in two other people from, like the HR, selected by HR, and they started destroying the group from within. Like they started arguing about pointless things, and like eventually, like a big sort of friction was created between, like the founders of the thing and HR, and like all of these old people were pushed out. So that was the end of that story, which prompted me later on to do something for which, like I may got, like a black mark in someone's file. But at one point I said, well, look, I mean, HR is a really powerful organization within Google, and like Google is a huge company. And like when you get a call from HR, like that's no good. Nobody wants to get a call from HR. It almost feels like like Nazi Germany, and like Gestapo is knocking at the door at some point. And so I proposed, look, and like a lot of complaints went against HR. Like Meme Gen was full of complaints about how they conduct their business, what their priorities are. Like the sex scandals, and like how they could allow like those things to pan out as they did pan out. And in one of my posts I said, well, like I mean, perhaps the solution is, like at one point we split a lot of groups internally at Google, and we created so-called product areas. So ads is a product area, and maps is a product area, and Android is a product area. And I just suggested, like, what, maybe, like HR should be actually split, and, you know, like report to each of the product areas, with the idea being that, you know, like, look, you have the same organization, it still has the same goal as, you know, like HR has today, but you have competition between various groups, and, you know, like different ideas of how to address issues, and different ideas of, you know, like who gets to work in the group and how they conduct themselves. I bet you, you know, like in the current constellation of HR, that did not, you know, like get me, you know, like extra points. I mean, it never touched my performance reviews or anything. I was always, you know, like exceeding expectations and all that. But I can certainly tell you, in an organization of this size and this complexity, that does not make you friends. So,
my last question, Boris, is what you instill in your students from your experience in Google. What is it that you want them to take away from what you learned for these 15 years?
So I just, you know, like had my first class for for this semester, and I can tell you, you know, like, and I'm teaching artificial intelligence. So I can tell you, and I, you know, like I have a syllabus online, and the students look at the syllabus and all that. And, you know, like I told them, okay, let's have a little bit of a free discussion, because we can still shape, you know, like the course and everything else. What are you guys interested in? And, you know, like roughly 50% of the questions went, you know, like into the area of ethics, privacy, data collection, and things of that sort. And I do have that in my program. It comes in the third of the program, when, you know, like I build a lot of muscle with them, where they, you know, like learn what the techniques are, where they're used, what is it that we do with our artificial intelligence in today's business environment, how different companies use this. And then once I give them this basic knowledge, so that they understand what is this, how this is useful and how it operates, then we're going to probe, you know, like the ethical and the privacy and all of the other questions and the security questions that are on many people's minds. So it's going to be interesting.
Boris, I would like to ask you to come back for future discussions with us. Google is a big topic, and same as Silicon Valley. We can't so cover it all in a 15 or 20-minute call, but we can do this frequently, and we have programs on a regular basis, and would love to see you again contribute content to ethics and tech. We will use this video on October 1st, and it'll be available on our site and YouTube and what have you right after we publish it on October 1st.
I'll be more than happy to join you, you know, like in future events, Vahid. I really think what you guys are doing is really important. You know, like this is not just an industry. This is a huge industry, which will only grow in the future. You know, like IT is the sector, you know, like that will, you know, like continue growing. And so, you know, like it will permeate every aspect of our lives. And, you know, like there's a lot of open questions out there. That's, you know, like I hope to contribute with my little bit of wisdom from working in Silicon Valley and in big tech. So.
Oh, no, you're a great contributor. Thank you so much, Boris. Thank you for your time.